I took the job because my mother was dying. Thrown out into the street with nothing but the uniform on my back.
I took the job because my mother was dying, and I had nothing left to offer her but a paycheck. The agency sent me to the Whitmore estate to work as a housemaid, and from the first morning I understood exactly where I stood. Mrs. Whitmore looked at me like a stain on her marble floors. Her son, Ethan, looked at me like I was actually a person. I told myself it didn't matter. I needed this job to pay for my mother's surgery, nothing more. But 3 months later, I woke up in a bed I didn't remember walking into, accused of something I never did, and thrown out into the street with nothing but the uniform on my back. What nobody in that house knew yet was that the woman who destroyed my life had planned every second of it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Victoria. I was 24 years old and my mother, Helen, had been sick for almost a year. The agency placement at the Whitmore estate was the only job that paid enough to even consider her surgery. Mrs. Whitmore made the rules clear on my first day. Breakfast by 7, the house spotless, her son Ethan's coffee ready before he asked for it, and no unnecessary conversation with him. I intended to follow every rule. I needed this job more than I needed my pride. But Ethan wasn't like his mother. He noticed me, the actual person underneath the uniform, and that alone was enough to make Mrs. Whitmore furious before I'd even done anything wrong. Ethan's fiancée, Bella, made her feelings clear the very first week. She looked at me like I'd tracked mud through the house just by existing. I stayed out of her way as much as I could. I wasn't interested in causing trouble. I was interested in my mother's medical bills. But Ethan kept finding reasons to talk to me anyway, kept noticing when something was wrong. One evening he saw me crying near the kitchen and wouldn't let it go until I told him about my mother. Instead of walking away like I expected, he offered to help pay for her surgery. I told him I couldn't accept that kind of money from my employer's son. He told me it wasn't a loan. It was simply what he wanted to do. Mrs. Whitmore noticed the shift immediately. She cornered Bella one evening, and though I wasn't meant to hear it, I caught enough to understand they were planning something. "We need something that will make him denounce her forever," Mrs. Whitmore said. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach that my time in that house was about to end, one way or another. A few nights later, Mrs. Whitmore asked me to bring her a glass of juice, insisted I pour one for myself as well since I'd been working since dawn. I drank it without thinking twice. Within 20 minutes, the room started spinning, and everything after that went dark. I woke up in a bedroom I didn't recognize, my uniform disheveled, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Ethan stood in the doorway, and behind him, Mrs. Whitmore and Bella wore expressions of practiced shock rather than genuine surprise. They accused me of sneaking into that room with the estate's gateman, of betraying the trust of the household. I told them the truth, that I had no memory of the night at all, that something wasn't right. Nobody believed me, not even Ethan, whose face had gone cold and unreadable. Mrs. Whitmore handed me a small envelope of cash before I left and told me never to return to the estate. I walked out with nothing but that envelope and a reputation I hadn't earned. My mother held me the night I came home in tears, and though her body was frail, her voice was steady. "The truth will surely come out," she told me, and I wanted so badly to believe her. Weeks later, at a routine checkup for the exhaustion I couldn't shake, a doctor delivered the news that changed everything. I was pregnant, and there was no question in my mind who the father was. I hadn't been with anyone else, drugged or otherwise, before that night at the estate. My mother's first reaction wasn't anger. It was quiet calculation about how 2 women already struggling to survive would now provide for a third life. I told her about the money Ethan had once given me before all of this happened, and that it might be enough to start something small of our own. I used what was left of that money to rent a tiny shop space, determined to build something for my child even if Ethan never knew he had one. Back at the estate, life moved forward without me. Mrs. Whitmore pressured Ethan into finally setting a wedding date with Bella, and though something in him had gone quiet and distant since I'd left, he agreed, worn down by months of his mother's insistence. Meanwhile, the estate's former gateman, the same man I'd been accused of betraying Ethan with, couldn't shake his guilt. He'd been warned by Mrs. Whitmore to stay silent about what he actually knew, but as Ethan's engagement drew closer, his conscience finally won. He showed up at the estate one evening, shaking, and told Ethan everything. There had been no affair, no betrayal. Mrs. Whitmore had orchestrated the entire incident to drive me out before I became a serious problem for Bella's engagement. Ethan confronted his mother directly, and after her denials collapsed under the weight of the gateman's testimony, she finally admitted what she'd done. "I did it for this family," she said, as if that justified stealing a year of my life and nearly costing me everything. Ethan didn't yell. He simply told his mother that a woman who would do that to an innocent person had never really known him at all, and he called off the engagement to Bella on the spot. Ethan spent weeks searching for me after that, starting with the estate where my mother and I used to live, only to learn we'd moved out months earlier with no forwarding address. He eventually found Becky, my old neighbor, who agreed to bring him to me the next morning rather than risk startling my mother by showing up unannounced at night. When Ethan finally stood in front of me again, visibly pregnant and steady on my own 2 feet for the first time in months, he didn't offer excuses. He simply asked me to let him explain, and for the first time, he brought the gateman with him to tell the truth himself, in person, so I would never have to wonder again whether I was believed. I told Ethan he had no idea what those months had cost me, the fear, the shame, the nights I didn't know how we'd eat. He didn't argue or minimize it. He simply said he knew, and that he intended to spend as long as it took making it right, starting with taking responsibility for our child regardless of what I decided about him. I let him back into my life slowly, one visit at a time, watching to see if his actions would match his words. They did. He found my mother and me a proper home, paid for the surgery he'd promised months earlier, and made it clear he wanted to be present for every part of our child's life, not out of obligation, but because he meant it. Mrs. Whitmore came to me eventually, humbled in a way I never expected from her, and asked for forgiveness. I told her what my mother had once told me, that everyone makes mistakes, and what matters most is what we learn from them. It wasn't the apology alone that mattered to me. It was watching her actually change afterward, showing up for her grandchild with the same devotion she once withheld from me. The night Ethan proposed, he told me I had come into his life exactly when he needed someone who believed in him rather than his money or his name. I said yes without hesitation, because I finally understood that the truth, however long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. If this story moved you, you're not alone, and there's more where this came from. Subscribe and stay with us for the next one.